I did apologize to the president. The president was offended by the or by the ad, rather.
In the world of big politics, apologies are a rare and costly gesture. But what made the Canadian Prime Minister publicly admit his guilt to Donald Trump? Why did an advertising campaign launched in Ontario cause a diplomatic storm between North America's two largest trading partners? Today, we'll talk about how one video became a symbol of internal strife and foreign policy crisis.
It's not something I would have done, which is to put in place that advertisement, and so I apologize to him. I'm the one, in English, I'm the one who is responsible in my role as Prime Minister for the relationship with the President of the United States.
As well as the hidden interests behind apologies that sound too carefully crafted to be spontaneous. When it comes to trade between Canada and the U.S., the stakes are always high. Nearly 3/4 of Canadian exports go to the American market, and any misstep in rhetoric can cost billions of dollars. It all started with a seemingly innocent advertising campaign designed to protect the domestic interests of Canadian industry. But what was supposed to be a display of national pride turned into a diplomatic conflict. Washington took the ad as an insult, and President Trump took it as a personal attack. And then the Canadian leader had to do what he had probably been avoiding since his first day as Prime Minister, apologize. But behind the scenes of this apology lies much more than a simple attempt to smooth over a misunderstanding. It is a clash of interests between the federal government and provincial authorities, a struggle for influence, and the right to determine who represents Canada on the world stage. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, despite warnings, decided not to back down and released the very video that angered the White House. The other provinces were divided. Some supported him, some condemned him, and some preferred to remain silent.
And the federal government is responsible for the foreign relationship with the U.S. government. So things happen. We take the good with the bad, and I apologize to him. I saw him. We had dinner. We had dinner together. You saw it. There were a few of you were there, and we had a very good dinner.
Thus, cracks appeared in Team Canada, and they became visible to the whole world. Meanwhile, tariff negotiations with the United States have stalled. The already fragile relationship is balancing between pragmatism and political pride. The Prime Minister says that Canada must build itself from within, invest, develop manufacturing, and seek new partners in Asia. He mentions free trade agreements with Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand, and even cautiously talks about prospects with India and China. It sounds like a strategy for independence. But can a country whose economy is 75% tied to the American market really afford such freedom? And finally, the main question: what is behind the apology? Is it an act of diplomatic courtesy or an admission of political defeat? Ahead of the new budget, the Prime Minister promises a course of internal strengthening and economic control. But critics see this as an attempt to divert attention from the failure of the negotiations. In this issue, we look at the story of an apology that called into question the unity of the country and showed how thin the line is between economic pragmatism and political dependence. We'll break down what really happened between Ottawa and Washington, why Trump took the ad as a blow, and what's next for Canada if trade talks with the U.S. have come to a complete standstill. This is not just a story about politics. It is a story about how one wrong word can change the course of relations between countries, and how one apology can mark the beginning of a new era.
Very cordial. And I spoke to him at the dinner privately, obviously. Privately, now it's public. There you go.
Since you're the person that's solely responsible for negotiations, did you inform Mr. Ford that this is something that you did not want to go forward with?
Yes.
When the Canadian Prime Minister stood before reporters, there was a strange silence in the room. His voice was steady, but there was a tense restraint in it, the kind that comes when you have to say words you don't want to say. He admitted that yes, he had indeed apologized to Donald Trump, and not behind the scenes, but officially through diplomatic channels. The reason was an advertising video released in Ontario, where criticism of U.S. tariff policy looked almost like an accusation of economic blackmail. The video was released under the slogan, "Protect Canadian Workers," and gained millions of views in a matter of hours. But for Washington, it was a personal challenge. The White House viewed the video as a political provocation aimed at undermining trade tariff negotiations. According to sources close to the Prime Minister, a call from the American administration came just 40 minutes after the video was published, and it was cold, even threatening in tone. Carney understood that every such episode was a risk not only to the country's image, but also to its entire economic structure.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
He acknowledged that the ad should not have been released. Moreover, he claims that he personally warned the provincial government of Ontario, and Doug Ford in particular, about the possible consequences. His words were emotionless, but they sounded like a reproach. This is not something I would approve of. It later emerged that on the day the video was released, there was a tense exchange of letters between the Prime Minister's office and Ford's office. The federal government asked for the video to be taken down, but Ontario refused, citing its right to defend the interests of the province. Behind the scenes in Ottawa, the incident was dubbed a small advertising war that unexpectedly turned into a major diplomatic crisis. The apology in question was not just a formality. According to officials close to the negotiations, Carney insisted that the message to Trump be personally dictated by him and delivered without intermediaries. In a letter that was later quoted in a number of American publications, he expressed regret that the advertisement could be perceived as criticism of the president and American policy, and emphasized that Canada remains a reliable partner and ally.
On November 4th, our government will table the first federal budget, our first federal budget. And that'll be our plan to protect our communities, our borders, our way of life. Our plan to build a stronger economy where everyone has a chance to get ahead. And our plan to empower Canadians with new opportunities, better careers, and a lower cost of living. Central to those missions.
It sounded soft and diplomatic, but to the domestic audience, especially those who considered Trump unpredictable and rude, it looked like humiliation. The paradox is that the apology, which was supposed to reduce tensions, only fueled the domestic political storm. The Canadian opposition accused the Prime Minister of weakness. A phrase that became a meme was heard in Parliament. He apologizes for someone else's truth. Against the backdrop of slowing tariff negotiations, falling steel and aluminum exports, and growing pressure from American manufacturers, the Prime Minister had to balance national pride with economic pragmatism. In private conversations, Carney, according to his aides, called what was happening a lesson in humility. He understood that Trump perceives any criticism not as a political act, but as a personal insult. Any word spoken in Ottawa could instantly reverberate in Washington, where the mood of the White House was determined not so much by experts as by the mood of one person. That is why the apology was not so much an act of diplomacy as a strategic move to save negotiations that were already hanging by a thread. When the Prime Minister told reporters, "I am the one responsible for relations with the U.S. president."
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
He effectively acknowledged that the federal government could no longer afford the luxury of political experiments by the provinces. It sounded like a signal. Foreign policy is no place for internal games. But in Canada, where federalism is deeply rooted, the provinces are accustomed to independence. In Ontario, where economic dependence on the U.S. is greatest, was not going to submit to Ottawa unconditionally. Behind the scenes of parliamentary sessions, a new battle began, not over tariffs, but over control of the foreign policy message. The Prime Minister's press service tried in vain to coordinate actions.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
But a number of provinces were already preparing their campaigns, each with its own agenda. British Columbia opposed unproductive pressure on Washington, while Manitoba, on the contrary, supported Ford's aggressive rhetoric, calling the ad the voice of the people. Within the country, there was a feeling that Canada was speaking with several voices at once, and none of them sounded confident. According to eyewitnesses, Carney took this internal chaos as a personal defeat. He understood that without a united front, the country looked weak. Americans don't respect those who argue with themselves, he said at a closed meeting. Addressing the ministers, it was a bitter truth. While the provinces were vying for influence, Washington suspended negotiations, and the economic consequences were felt almost immediately. According to the Department of Commerce, steel exports to the U.S. fell by 18% in a month, and aluminum exports by 12%. But behind the public apologies and dry phrases lay another reality: diplomatic fatigue. The Canadian negotiating team had spent months trying to maintain the previous level of duty-free trade.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Maneuvering between threats of new tariffs and Trump's unpredictable tweets, any spark could have derailed the process, and this commercial was just such a spark. The Prime Minister understood that if the conflict was not resolved immediately, not only would relations with the U.S. suffer, but so would Canada's reputation as a reliable partner. Therefore, an apology was inevitable, and in fact became an act of self-preservation. Meanwhile, when he said, "We take the good with the bad," the audience perceived it as an admission of powerlessness. But there was another subtext to these words. The Prime Minister was trying to show that Canada is not a country of reactions, but a country of solutions. He knew that the U.S. administration was considering introducing new restrictions on auto parts imports at the time.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
And any escalation could lead to the loss of tens of thousands of jobs. The apology, however humiliating it may have seemed, was a way to buy time. Ford, for his part, did not publicly comment on his conversation with the Prime Minister. But people close to him claimed that he considered the apology a sign of weakness. According to them, Ontario was not going to give in because it saw this as a chance to boost its popularity, to present itself as a defender of the real economy, as opposed to the cautious bureaucrats in Ottawa. Thus, the internal struggle for power became intertwined with international trade diplomacy. When a journalist asked, "So you told Ford not to release the ad, but he did it anyway," the Prime Minister replied briefly, "You saw what happened." These words became textbook. They reflected everything: fatigue, hidden anger, and the realization that it is becoming almost impossible to govern a country where each province conducts its own foreign policy. Meanwhile, Washington was closely monitoring the situation. According to insiders, Trump himself not only watched the controversial video, but also discussed it at a meeting, calling it an unfriendly act.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
After Carney's apology, tensions did ease, but the American side still suspended part of the negotiations. It was a reminder that even the slightest miscommunication can cost a country months of progress. The Prime Minister returned to Ottawa with the understanding that control over internal discourse was now a matter of national security. He instructed his team to develop a new strategy for interacting with the provinces so that such episodes would not be repeated. Inside the document, as later leaked to the press, was the phrase, "We must speak with one voice even if we think differently." These first 2 points in the story, the apology and the internal division, became the starting point for everything that followed. They showed how fragile diplomacy can be when personal ambitions and regional interests collide with global economic realities. And although the Prime Minister spoke calmly, his voice conveyed the main point: the understanding that a single promotional video could undermine what had been built over decades.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Trust between the two countries and among Canadians themselves. After the public apology mentioned earlier, the atmosphere surrounding the federal government became noticeably heavier. The word division was heard more and more often in the corridors of Parliament and in the press. Support for the Prime Minister began to waver, and regional leaders, sensing the weakness of the center, began to speak louder than usual. It cannot be said that it was a rebellion. But that is how it was described by anonymous sources from the Prime Minister's office. When several provinces began to come up with their own initiatives in response to trade pressure from the U.S., it became clear that Team Canada was turning into a field of political controversy. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, remained adamant. He openly stated that Ottawa could not decide for him how to protect the province's economy. His rhetoric included references to centralization of power.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by
Elites out of touch with reality, and the federal government's inability to act decisively. Although provincial premiers did not officially challenge Ottawa's foreign policy monopoly, each of them began to build their own channels of communication with U.S. states. British Columbia, for example, held talks with California on energy issues bypassing the federal cabinet. Manitoba established direct contacts with Minnesota on agriculture. Formally, these were economic missions, but in essence, they were diplomatic detours, creating the impression that each Canadian province was building its own mini diplomatic front. Against the backdrop of these events, a new debate emerged in society. Can Canada speak with one voice at all if each region is pulling the blanket over itself? The opposition in Parliament added fuel to the fire.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Claiming that the Prime Minister had lost control of the situation and allowed internal contradictions to weaken the country's position on the international stage. An editorial in a major newspaper included the phrase, "Washington sees two Canadas, one that apologizes and one that argues." This image instantly spread across social media, becoming a political weapon. Meanwhile, negotiations with the United States, which were already difficult, came to a complete standstill. The American side cited unclear positions of the Canadian government and internal disagreements. In essence, Canada's diplomatic machine faced a paradox. While the federal cabinet was trying to restore trust, the provinces were demonstrating independence, weakening the common line. At a meeting in Ottawa, where representatives from all regions gathered, the Prime Minister said bluntly that the country risked losing what had been built over decades: stable trade relations in which Canada was not a supplicant but an equal partner. However, even this statement did not lead to unity. That was when the most painful conversations began. The Canadian press, which had received leaks from federal structures, wrote that American negotiators demanded guarantees of consensus between Ottawa and the provinces before continuing the dialogue. Such a document would essentially mean the subordination of the regions to the foreign policy of...
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Of the federal government, which they could not allow. A deadlock ensued, and its consequences were felt more and more strongly. The Canadian dollar fell, investors began to postpone decisions, and business associations demanded to stop quarreling and get down to business. According to people close to him, the Prime Minister did not hide his irritation. He believed that there were too many people in the country who were trying to play on internal discontent, forgetting about global risks. At one of the closed meetings, he said, Americans don't see the nuances. For them, Canada is either united or weak. And these words were later quoted by almost all television channels and became a symbol of what was happening. Canada did indeed appear fragmented, and this image was beginning to work against it. At the same time, Trump and his entourage took advantage of the situation. According to analysts, the American side began to work selectively with the governors of border states.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Promising them new bilateral agreements, bypassing the Canadian federal government. It was a cunning move to divide allies from within, using their own regional ambitions. For the first time in a decade, Canadian diplomacy faced the threat of losing not only its influence, but also its control over foreign economic policy. Against this backdrop, the Prime Minister attempted to steer the negotiations back onto a constructive path. He pointed out that despite the disputes, 85% of trade between the countries remained duty-free, and that both sides were much more dependent on each other than was commonly acknowledged. But the words about interdependence sounded less and less convincing when signals came from Washington about the readiness to expand tariffs on steel and automobiles. These two industries were critically important to Ontario, and so Ford continued to press, arguing that the time for compromise is over. Meanwhile, internal discussions turned into open political struggle. Provincial leaders began to use the trade issue to boost their own ratings. They held press conferences accusing Ottawa of concessions to Trump and a loss of sovereignty. Even moderate politicians who had previously supported the federal government were now talking about the need for a new format.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
For interaction with the U.S., the public increasingly felt that the Prime Minister was not up to the task. And yet, amid this chaos, Carney's speech at one of the press conferences was an attempt to restore strategic focus. He reminded everyone that the problem was not just tariffs. The U.S. had applied measures under Section 232 of the Trade Act, viewing imports of steel and aluminum as a threat to national security. This was not just economic pressure, but political pressure. We can argue about advertising, but we are talking about the rules by which the world lives, he said. These words became key. The Prime Minister was trying to shift attention from the internal struggle to the global picture. Canada found itself in a position where it could not afford open conflict, but did not want to capitulate either.